And now we would like to start the International University of Japan JICA Ogata Research Institute Knowledge Forum, Security and Development Cooperation in Compounded Crisis, the Impacts of the Ukraine Crisis, and State, Economic, and Human Security. Once again, let me introduce myself. I am Mariama from the JICA Ogata Research Institute. Thank you. First of all, we would like to have an opening address from the research advisor of JICA Ogata Research Institute, Dr. Nobuko Kayashima. Please turn on your camera. Over to you, Dr. Kayashima. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I am Kayashima from JICA Ogata Research Institute. On opening of this knowledge forum, I'd like to say a few words. At the JICA Ogata Research Institute, we provide the venue for the free discussion for the multiple stakeholders to get together who are interested in the international development. This knowledge forum has been held since January 2019. With the co-opsis of the International University of Japan, this knowledge forum is held under the theme of Security and Development Cooperation in Compounded Crisis. We invite the Professor of Yamaguchi and Tadokoro of the International University of Japan, who are the expert on international security and economic security. And with the spread of COVID-19 in 2020, there is a huge impact on society and economy and politics, and the delay in the pre-existing global challenge like climate change have been a major concern. And meanwhile, in February, Russia invaded Ukraine, and due to the stagnation of import from Ukraine and Russia, the food and energy shortage have occurred, and that deal a great blow to the people's daily lives. And the inflation and the currency depreciation and the debt worsening and the Chinese deceleration and the poor macroeconomic outlook, these are the major challenges we are faced with. This is a crisis upon crisis, or we are in extremely destabilized situation in a compounded crisis. This compounded crisis is expected to deal a great blow on the people in a vulnerable position in the developing countries. And this is a serious threat from the viewpoint of human security. And today we will talk about the global challenges in the compounded crisis, and to talk about the measures for the strengthening of the resilience as well as stabilization. And we have invited the experts from the viewpoint of the national security, economic security, as well as human security to discuss these perspectives. JICA Ogata Research Institute research and analyze the human security and the practice from the various perspectives. And in March this year, we published a flagship report entitled Human Security Today. We sincerely hope that the presentation and discussion with you in today's knowledge forum will make contribution to the progress of research on the human security. And today we have many participation from the various universities in Japan, and with the support from many Japanese universities, JICA accept the international students from developing countries, including Ukraine and Moldova and other neighboring countries. And while staying here in Japan, so that the international students can deepen the understanding on Japanese development experience, we conduct the JICA Development Studies Program, JICA DSP. And I sincerely hope that you can get more insights on JICA by accepting the international students through discussion and presentation today. Thank you very much.
に沿って
And now, according to the program for today, the panelists will be giving their presentations in order. So today, as a presenter, we have Dr. Noboru Yamaguchi, Professor of International University. We have Mr. Akio Takahara, Executive Director. And we have Koji Makino, Director General of this institute. So as for the panelists, when you do your presentations, please make sure that you turn on your cameras when you open your presentations. And for the audience, as we announced before, on the screen we will be showing the presentation slides in Japanese, and if you wish to refer to the English version slides, please go to the chat box to download your English version slide. So Dr. Yamaguchi, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yamaguchi from the International University, and it is a great honor for me to be able to present today in conjunction with the JICA International Cooperation Agency Knowledge Forum. And this is a very timely topic, and I have been looking forward to this. And we will be talking about the impact of the Ukraine crisis and state economic and human security. So I will also be serving as the moderator for the panel later. And at the beginning of this session, I would like to talk about, just briefly, what has been taking place in Ukraine from my own perspectives, making use of my background, because I have been involved in the securities-related areas for some time. And then after me, we will be asking specialists from each area. Dr. Takahara will be talking about a specific area, and Dr. Tadokoro will be talking from the perspective of international economic security and international political security. And lastly, we will also look at this from a perspective of human security matters by Dr. Tadokoro. So we will be speaking for about 7, if not 10 minutes each, and then we will also have interactions, discussions among the panelists. And lastly, for about 20 minutes, we would like to keep that time and open up to the audience to take some questions. So that is how we would like to go forward with today's session. So let me share my PowerPoint slide on the screen. Talking about this topic from the experience of Japan. So in between the two great wars, between World War I and World War II. So when we look at Ukraine, the population is 1/3 of Japan, but the area coverage is about 1.5 times as that of Japan. So it is a large country, and when we compare the area or the space of Ukraine, and if you try to put it over the map of China, on the right-hand side is the northern part of China with Beijing at the center. So it is an area called the Northern China region where the Japanese Northern China forces were stationed. And Russian troops, actually 120,000 of them, invaded this area. And when the Russians came into Ukraine, they were to conquer the city of Kiev within 10 days and to conquer all of Ukraine within just a matter of weeks. And I had difficulty understanding how rapidly they can actually come into a foreign country in this manner. And I really thought it was strange that the Russians really believed that they would be able to achieve this kind of accomplishment. And looking at the right-hand side, the map is that of northern China, where the Japanese forces invaded this area after the Marco Polo incident with 1 million soldiers. And as a result, the areas that the Japanese were able to control are the black dotted areas only, vis-a-vis the greater area, the space. So these are areas alongside the railroads and the cities and towns that are lined along the railroads. So even with 1 million soldiers, the Japanese were able to only control a very limited area in northern China. So with this in mind, if the Russians really thought that they will be able to completely conquer Ukraine with only 120,000 troops, this is something that really poses a lot of questions. And maybe there was some background that forced President Putin to say that, yes, it is certainly possible to accomplish this kind of goal, and maybe there was something going on behind the scenes. So this is the list of the historical incidents between the two great wars. And so in 1919, the First World War came to an end. And in 1941, Japan opened the doors to the Second World War by invading the Indo-Chinese peninsula. So in between, in 1931, we had the Manchurian incident. This was actually prior to Hitler coming to power in Germany. And so if we try to fit this to Ukraine, in 2014, when Russia somehow sneaked into southern part of Ukraine and annexed the Crimean Peninsula, maybe this might be taken as a similar situation. And if we look at the world now, maybe this was equivalent to the Pearl Harbor attack, or maybe this was equivalent to the Second Sino-Japanese War starting. So from my perspective, I really hope that Russia would stop and think over this process once again, based on what the Japanese experienced between the two great wars. And for example, Japan really failed greatly with the attack on Pearl Harbor. So maybe the Russians are in a similar situation right now. And but although they have not really greatly succeeded, they have started the war, and they have lost the chance to close the initiative. So currently, when we look at the offensive or the counteroffensive from Ukraine, there are several reasons to this, and let me cover some of the background on this. First is the people, because this war was actually caused by a person called Mr. Putin. And then the role played by President Zelensky is also quite significant in this, how this incident unrolled. So I attended the Halifax Security Forum between the 18th and to 20th of November in Canada, and the theme was Ukraine itself. And lawmakers as well as military personnel from Ukraine were also participating in this forum, and the officers from the NATO countries were also attending this forum. So it was a very meaningful session. And in that session, President Zelensky delivered in his T-shirt attire, as usual. It came on video and delivered his message to the audience. And I think this was one indication of his great leadership, and that really shows about his personality.
And also in mass media, various things are covered. A smart weapon like a Javelin portable missile and have been provided by the United States and the NATO countries to Ukraine. And the tank is a very formidable, and usually you can the tip of the tank is the very weak and fragile part, and once you strike the missile, and then from the top of the tank, then this missile will strike the tank, and then the fire will spread within the tank, and then in this case, there are storage of the firearms, and then the top of the tank will take off, and then the tank will be destroyed. And that is what the smart weapon does. This is the drone, and the Turkish drone also played a great role. And on top of that, in the Halifax Security Forum, what most frequently heard word was that they need more fires. They said that they need the 155 millimeter ammunitions because they need a significant amount of ammunitions. So that is what they demanded. Ukrainian forces per day fire 3,000 or per month 90,000 ammunitions are fired, and 14,000 rounds of ammunitions are produced per month by the United States. So they need 6 months to produce this amount of the ammunition, and actually that is exactly that the Ukrainian really want to get. So the NATO countries' support to Ukraine was very visible. This is the publicly available publication called the Military Balance, an annual publication as shown in red line, 54 and 310 for the United States. Approximately 400 troops or the soldiers were sent to Ukraine, and as of 2015, already they provided training and provided support to Ukrainian forces, and you can see the other numbers, but this represent the various support in terms of the number of troops and soldiers from the West to Ukraine. The Canada, Baltic three countries, they are small countries. However, they dispatch significant troops. Already, I am running out of time. But finally, one point. The shadow of the nuclear weapon is something I'd like to touch upon. At the beginning of opening a war, Belarus changed their constitution so that they can host nuclear weapons. That is the Russian nuclear weapons. At the same time, officially, the Putin said that they are fragile and Europe is stronger because Russia is weaker, and the stronger Europe, once they intervene, and we are forced to resort to the final last resort. So it's like that they are safe, but they are declaring they will become the rover with a so what attitude. So they hinted the I will still, however, if there is no intervention, I will be quietly leaving. However, if you are more intervening, then the outrageous thing will happen. And President Putin was hinting the strategic nuclear weapon. And also in November this year, Mr. Xi Jinping met with Japanese and German counterparts, and he concurred that they are against the nuclear war and the nuclear threat. So in this bilateral meeting, Mr. Xi Jinping concurred with the Japanese and the German counterparts, and that was a great attainment. So there are various complex factors intertwined with each other in the security arena. So if I show you two good, great example, that will be causing too much nuances to other speakers. So I'd like to end here. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Takahara from the lens of China to give us a presentation. Good afternoon. Together with Dr. Tadokoro and Dr. Yamaguchi of International University of Japan, I am very happy to give you a presentation today. And let me begin. As Dr. Yamaguchi gave us a very insightful presentation. And also, as mentioned by Dr. Kayashma, JICA, especially JICA Ogata Research Institute, put an emphasis on human security. And later, Dr. Makino will give us more detail. The human lives and the daily lives, and also the dignity should be protected. That is the human security, and also the pandemic and climate change is something we should protect ourselves against. But now the war is unraveling in Ukraine, and we are seeing the tragic events. So from that perspective, international politics is very important. What is the position that China takes in relation to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine? From that perspective, I'd like to give you some talk. And here, you can see the picture taken on 4th of February when the President Putin visited Mr. Xi Jinping alongside the opening of the Beijing Olympic game, and it seems as if that they are creating a new international order in their communique with China. And Russia-China stand against attempt by external forces to undermine security and stability in the common adjacent regions, etc. That is the contents of Sino-Russo joint statement. Would that be okay for Russia to cause disruption in the international affairs? That is the question I'd like to ask. And the final point here is the friendship between the two states has no limits, and there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. So this is the joint communique 20 days before the opening of the war. And then on February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. So in this joint statement, they envisioned the world vision. What was the background? Mr. Xi Jinping and Mr. Putin, they share the similar world view. What are they? Too much rights given to refugees and the LGBTQ lead to internal divisions and the failure of democracies. So as a result, the US-led international order is going through a crisis, and it is China and Russia with the traditional values who are leading the new order. That is the shared world view. Well, the color revolution in the former Soviet Union countries, those autocratic countries turned the democratic countries, and they are referred to as the color revolution. And they also concur that they need to be aware of the color revolution, and also view the world through the lens of the competition with the U.S. So when China look at Russia, China sees U.S. there. So from that perspective, there is a common world view. In order to win the competition with the U.S., China would like to cherish the partnership with Russia. Mr. Xi Jinping, on the following day of the Ukrainian invasion, they emphasized that Xi Jinping emphasized that he respected action taken by the Russian leader under the current critical situation. And also on June 15th, he said that the legitimacy of Russia's action to protect fundamental national interests in the face of challenges to its security created by external forces. However, the situation changed in September. Mr. Xi Jinping changed his position.
And this is something that you could tell from what Putin said, because in Samarkand, they had top-level talks between Xi and Putin. And there she said that Putin said that we appreciate our Chinese friends' balanced position in a connection with the Ukraine crisis. We understand your questions and your concerns in regard. So here, she actually expressed questions as well as concerns. So if you look at this photograph of Putin, you can obviously see that he is not smiling. So probably he is quite concerned, and he was quite concerned about what she spoke in Samarkand. And so this was quite strange. This was something that really surprised me, because only 6 days prior to that, on the 9th of September, the person who is the third person at the highest ranks of Chinese Communist Party visited Moscow, Mr. Li Jianshu, and he was actually the chairperson of the People's Congress in China, and he met with the lower house people of Russia, of the Russian Federation. And at that point, he expressed that China understands and supports Russia on issues that represent its vital interests. So this was the position that was indicated by China. And only 6 days afterwards, she was beginning to pull back a little bit. So this was quite surprising. And why did this happen? It's because there were several causes. One is because of the counteroffensive by Ukraine, and the situation was changing. And also, in Samarkand, Putin also met with President Modi of India. And President Modi really told Mr. Putin that it is not a time for war. And I think that also comes from this very delicate situation and the change of the situation in Ukraine. And also, in China, there were also many opposing opinions inside China, because there was opposition inside China saying that maybe the Russian policy might not be the right way to go. Maybe China should be in line with the mainstream of the world, which was the initiative being taken by the Western countries. And in October, they had a Communist Party conference, and maybe they were starting to see that the flow had changed. And also, the Chinese were actually suffering from the economic downturn as a result of the COVID countermeasures, and they needed to do something to recover from this situation. And they were obliged to try to improve relations with Europe, the US, as well as Japan, because Europe, especially Germany, countries like Germany, are really focusing on what China is taking as its position. So China started to think that it might be beneficial for them to start siding more with the European and the Western side. And why did Putin start the war? Probably Mr. Xi himself had difficulty fully understanding why it happened. And Putin was not really happy with the fact that he was being treated as a loser of the Cold War. But China, on the other hand, is in the position to become one of the greatest leading nations in the world. So there was nothing that was pulling them back. And so with this kind of contrast between China and Russia, probably that is where we see a difference in attitude. And if I were able to explain a little bit about the trend in global politics, I hope I was able to offer you some hints. And time has come for me to close. Thank you very much. Thank you. In a very compact manner, I think you covered all of the important points that you needed to cover. So I hope that will be good food for thought for the panel discussion later. And also, the comments about the possibility of nuclear weapon use, and also, as Dr. Takahara said, probably this had to do with the timing. So now let us turn to Dr. Tadokoro for his presentation. This is Tadokoro speaking. Good afternoon. Let me share my slide on the screen. So the theme that I will be talking about is about, as a political economist, I would like to talk about the impact on the international economy as well as international politics in a nutshell. And when we look back around 30 years, the students that I teach had the impression that the Cold War is something from the past. That is the kind of memory those students had. So when we look at the era of the post-Cold War era, this is an era of globalization, if we put it in one word. And this is about pursuing the global economy. And when we talk about globalization of the economy, the role played by the state is becoming smaller. I think that is the general understanding. So going beyond borders, capital, people, and things were transcending across borders. And So in this era of globalization, the role that is expected to be played by the state is something of the past. And I think that was the general impression that people had. But in the past few years, especially when we look at our relations with China, the relations between the West and the China, it has become quite obvious that this has become quite decisive with the Ukraine war. And also, the role to be played by the state in the global economy is now starting to be revisited. And this is a transition that we are seeing right in front of our eyes. So that is the first point I would like to make. And so it doesn't translate well into Japanese, but it is about the state or the national government taking the lead in controlling and managing the economy. We call it economic statecraft in English. And we talked about this as commercialism, or this is something from the past and outdated. But now what we see in the world is nothing more than economic statecraft. And the second point that I would like to make is, in this kind of, given the circumstances, it's not that we have gone back to the days of the Cold War. So what is different from the days of the Cold War? There are several points. One obvious area is that we have the global south, the countries in the global south, and their position is quite significantly different from that of the Cold War era. So when we do have time later on, I would go touch on more details then, but it's not that the economic sanctions against Russia is to be supported by a great majority of all the other states in countries in the globe, because we see quite a few countries that are taking a very sensitive stance vis-a-vis Russia in this. So when the time does come, I would like to go into more details. And with the end of the globalization era, what is clear is that now we are seeing more geopolitical risks that have surfaced. And no matter how much we say that politics and the economy are different, but when some country uses violence or force to invade another country's sovereignty, then you cannot really keep talking this way. So we have never seen economic sanctions taking place on such a large scale. And in such a world, each country will have to really consider the position to be taken. And in the mid to long term, the global market, the instability of the market is something that has been called upon even before the Ukraine invasion started. We have heard that this is a once-in-a-century incident like the financial crisis by Lehman several years ago. So in the world of international finance, with the era of globalization, I think we are seeing greater risks for financial instability. And in Japan, we have said that the bubble collapsed. But so this is now starting to happen more at a global level, and this also happened in the United States. So the instability of the market is something that is now in the minds of people around the world. And related to that is we have this issue of inequality of distribution. When we look at the West, I think this is even more obvious than in Japan. So populism is becoming more popular in politics, where the middle class have a lot of grudges in terms of their financial standing, and this has become quite more obvious. And probably about 2 to 3 decades ago, companies like Amazon and Google, the GAFA companies, did not even exist then.
But these entrepreneurs of these companies achieve the significant affluence, and they have the significant asset and wealth, even bigger than the some countries' GDP. So that has led to the dissatisfaction toward the inequality of distribution. So talking about the economic and political trend. Well, in the past, we were living in the globalized world, and therefore we procured goods in the cheapest manner so that we can get the highest margin, so we can gain the maximum efficiency for the growth. That was the motivation of the past. However, now going forward, the economic goal is, of course, the efficiency and growth. Their significance is not lost. However, relatively stability and the resilience, which means that the economy can recover quickly against some shocks. That is what we will be aiming for. Due to the pandemic, the mask shortage become a very big problem. So we felt the importance of resilience. In terms of relationship with China, we have experienced some problems or economic impacts. So now that the stability and the economic resilience are in greater need nowadays. So within the national border, trying to produce the goods, and in a sensitive area, the countries try to minimize the dependence on the external countries, and also the countries try to strengthen the relationship with neighboring countries or the countries in the region, the so-called regionalism. It does not mean that this regionalism did not exist in the era of globalization, but the more than the location or geography, what is more important is to strengthen the relationship with the friendly countries. The so-called political economic realignment is underway. In the past, despite the differences of political differences, the people thought that they can team up with each other, but such kind of optimism is now in decline and becoming under disappointments. So does it mean that we are living just like a Cold War? Earlier, we talked about whether the history rhymes. There might be similarity, but not exactly the same. How are we different? How is the current era different from the Cold War? Well, during the Cold War, the West and the East were completely divided in terms of economic relationship, while economic exchanges were very negligible and small. However, during the globalization period, the economic dependence made a significant progress, and in that context, China emerged as a powerful player. And although the Russia is not a major economy, however, the Russia is not the a minor energy supplier that we can neglect. So in this interdependent economic world, the countries has to protect their own national interests. Such motivation will be felt strongly. What is interesting here is that China is closer to Russia. As of recently, there might be some rift, but having said that, China is willing to purchase cheap energy from Russia, and you may find it unexpected, but India has a favorable relationship with Russia, and India is purchasing energy from Russia, and Pakistan is also having in the similar position. What was unexpected was Turkey. It is the NATO members. So in terms of the framework, they are leaned toward the West. However, for Turkey, the economic relationship with Russia is very important. So their position is mixed. So the global South position is quite nuanced. And then when it comes to the sanction, the priority differs, and the different countries' interest will be prioritized. No longer that the economic superiority of the U.S. is overwhelming, so the country-to-country confrontation is strongly felt right now. So these global South countries will be discussed from the viewpoint of human security later, but people may feel that we don't have the sufficient leeway. And it does not mean that people are endorsing Russia ideologically. However, the country cannot ignore the economic interest. And on top of that, some countries are closer to Russia have some geopolitical considerations or interest. After the end of the Cold War, Western-driven neoliberalism, such kind of development strategy was implemented. However, some kind of frustration or discontent was felt among the global South, and they are now erupting. And one more minute to go. Maybe we haven't crossed the point of no return. How is it likely that this will come to an end? How will the war between Russia and Ukraine come to an end? And I didn't forecast that this war will occur. So the settlement through negotiation seems to be the best end result. However, it is unlikely. That would be ideal. In the midst of war fighting, this negotiated settlement is unlikely. After the war fighting is stalemated, and then there might be a signs or possibility of a negotiated settlement. And I do not rule out the possibility of a decisive defeat of either country. And in that case, in the long term, it will have a long-term impact, and the question here is whether the Russia's regime will be maintained, and if Ukraine is annexed, then the Baltic country will be concerned that they will be the next target, and NATO and the EU countries would think that this is their problem. And so this is not such an easy problem. And whatever scenario will unveil, I don't know which will transpire, but the economic decoupling is irreversible going forward. However, it does not mean that the just like the Cold War, there is a subtle decoupling between the West and China and Russia. So how the decoupling will transpire, that will be the key. And with whom to tie up, and the political economic realignments among nations will be a major agenda going forward. That is my conclusion. Thank you very much. Thank you. From the viewpoint of economy, the situation is more complicated. I think that is something you can understand. Especially, this is something I'd like to hear more later. And now the economic sanction is imposed in a larger scale, and unexpected and uncalculated impacts are being felt around the world. That is the concern. And also in a compounded manner, the war is underway, and therefore we are in a compounded crisis mode. So now, Dr. Makino, please. So I was attentive to the previous distinguished speakers, and they talk about the security from different perspectives. But from me, I'd like to talk about the human security, or security from the viewpoint of a human. The crisis over crisis. Though the pandemic hasn't come to an end, that the Russia invaded Ukraine, so the compounded crisis is now what we are witnessing. So the countries and the people in the most vulnerable positions are feeling the strongest impact. And to that end, to protect the recovery and increase the resilience, such kind of policy action will be necessary.
So when we focus on the people, what are the people thinking about? So let's look at this. So this was announced by the WEF on the perception survey of this year. So this is covering for the from now until 3 years from now. So only the right-hand side are the people who have a positive perspective, and the remaining 90% believe that the world is really in a dark era. So that is the result. And when we look at the refugees as well as the evacuees, domestic evacuees, this has been really greatly grown because of the Ukraine incident, and now as of May this year, it has exceeded 100 million people. And I mentioned we need to focus on the people with vulnerability, but when we look at the regions and the people with vulnerability, that is most concentrated in the African region. And compared to a decade ago, the GDP has submerged back to 10 years ago. And on the right-hand side, we also see that there are a lot of learning losses due to COVID-19. And it's not only with the children, but it is also with the grown-ups. And these children will be rearing the next generation going. So that raises a concern. And another issue that we need to look at is the food crisis. Because from Russia and Ukraine, especially when it comes to flour, Africa depends on importing flour, as much as 35 to 100% of their flour from Russia and Ukraine. So this is a great problem. And then what can we do about human security given these kinds of circumstances? Frankly speaking, this concept of human security is a good concept. However, it is quite difficult to understand, to really accurately understand this concept. But the core part is actually very simple. So as you can see in this UNDP report, is that unless people can have safe lives, then it will be impossible to realize peace in the world. So these people, as you can see in this photograph, these are moms. They always think that if they have a sufficient amount of food, and they are concerned if they might not be losing their jobs, and they are concerned about any crimes happening in their neighborhood, and also to assure people's security is that the children do not die, that the infectious disease do not spread, people do not lose their jobs, and the conflicts between ethnic groups do not develop into something major. So these are something that all relate to maintaining the dignity of human livelihood. And so when we look at the Ukraine situation, COVID-19, climate change, all of those things, having a resilient society that is able to withstand these kinds of threats is something that will be able to assure the continuation of people's lives and livelihoods and dignity. So we talk about resilience a lot today, but no matter how much in scope and degree we have the threats coming at us, it is important to have the resilience. That is a key word. And we have the very rapid type of threats, and then we also have a more chronic type of threats. And so whether it's acute or chronic is something that we have to look at. So creating a society that is resilient vis-a-vis both the acute and chronic types of threats is very important. And the right-hand graph looks at the progress on the SDG index on human development. And the green line, the arrow that goes up from left to right, is the ideal. But in reality, it is more of a zigzag line, as I indicated in the red line, because wars and conflicts happen, and then sometimes you are pulled back. So by having the resilience, you are actually able to bounce back. And on the right-hand side is the SDGs, and due to COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021, and probably even this year too, the SDG index is probably going down a little bit. So that is why resilience becomes more important. And stabilizing the society is where SDG, human security, becomes one of the foundations of SDGs. And for the interest of time, I'm not going into detail here, but this is the significance of human security. And we are really focusing on the kind of crises that are connected to each other, because in multiple areas, we do not pick them one by one, but these are compounded issues, and we need to look at the correlated or connected issues by region or by country. And to counter all of these issues, it is important to take a cross-sectional approach. And it is easier said than done, but the national government of Japan and other companies as well as JICA is really struggling with this. And the third point is, in order to proceed with these kinds of cross-sectoral efforts or cross-disciplinary approach, it is important to have a collaboration between the private and public sectors, as well as among the international organizations. And lastly, in order to realize a human security, development cooperation is very important. And I would like to raise JICA's example of the Africa Food Safety Initiative. This is to provide necessary energy for 250 million people by the year 2030, and to be able to produce food for that amount of people. And it is to enable the people in Africa to be able to produce the necessary food by themselves. And then for the second part about support for Ukraine by JICA, we have the 3 pillars. One is to support the national foundations of Ukraine. This is something that is being done in conjunction with the World Bank, and we have already worked on a loan of up to 78 billion Japanese yen in the areas of education as well as payrolls for the Ukrainian government officials. And then the second point is about realizing stability in the surrounding countries, such as Moldova, where the refugees from Ukraine are spilling out. And then the third point is an effort that is in preparation for the recovery and reconstruction of the devastated areas. And we are now focusing on the necessary initiatives to to withstand the winter climate. Thank you very much, Mr. Makino. It was a comprehensive presentation about human security. I have never heard such a simplistic presentation on this topic. And I sometimes believe I myself am not a safe person to begin with. Well, maybe you are not a safe person. So we are going over time a little bit. But I'd like to thank all the presenters from each of your perspectives for sharing us your presentations. So in the same order as the presenters presented, I would like to go around asking questions. So to Dr. Takahara, so I would like to also touch on the areas that you did not touch upon in the presentation. So regarding Taiwan, when the invasion to Ukraine took place, and if Kyiv was to be invaded very easily, I was worried that this would really encourage China to do the same on Taiwan. And so thanks to the counteroffensive by the Ukrainian people, it did not turn out to be that easy. So that was a positive effect. But in today's world, it was just astonishing that a country can so bluntly invade another country like that, and that was another thing that was surprising. So what do you think about those things? And also to Dr. Tadokoro, the global economy is now undergoing a lot of impacts and influences from uncontrollable elements, and the dangers that are being posed by those elements. And in the old days, the world was split into different zones or blocks by east and west. But now you said that today it is impossible to split the world into these blocks. So what kind of a dynamic world should we be looking at? So that is what I would like to ask you. And to Mr. Makino, going forward, when we look at the support for Ukraine, maybe we can narrow down this issue a little bit, but with such devastation taking place in the Ukraine, so with all the damages and the refugees, it is such a devastation. But I mentioned that of the 3,000 bombs that were dropped, and one bomb is about 45 kilograms. And in a war front that is not moving ahead very speedily, many of those bombs are shot at the wrong direction and they miss their target. So I do not have the exact percentage, but I would say 99% of those bombs explode, but several percentage points of the bombs do not explode. And later on, as we see in areas like Cambodia, really innocent children become victims to those unexploded bombs on a later day. So as Japan, is there anything that we can do as our country in this kind of perspective? So what kind of support shall we be looking at towards Ukraine going forward is something I would like to hear from you more.
So first, Dr. Takahara, please. Thank you very much for your question. Because of a time shortage, I skip. But many people are concerned about Taiwan. What has happened in Europe may occur in Asia, that is publicly stated. And due to time constraints, to make a long story short, to give you conclusion first, well, for the time being, Mr. Xi Jinping doing the same thing as Mr. Putin to the Taiwan. That possibility would be low. That is my perspective. Taiwanese and the Chinese experts also share the same view in Japan. Why is that? From the viewpoint of Mr. Xi Jinping, what is the higher priority? What kind of agenda is the higher priority? That is what we have to pay attention to. Well, from the viewpoint of Mr. Xi Jinping, maintaining his regime is the high in agenda. Not only his position, but also the one-party rule of a Communist Party are the top priority. And in accordance with those priorities, whether invading Taiwan is positive or negative, that would be the logic of Mr. Xi Jinping. No doubt that China pay attention to and observe the Ukraine economically and militarily and diplomatically, and what kind of impact does this Russia's invasion of Ukraine have on Russia, that is calculated and observed with calmness by China. At this point in time, comprehensively, for China to invade Taiwan would have a more negative impact than the negative impact to the maintenance of the one-party rule. So for the time being, I don't think that the China will invade Taiwan. That is the conclusion. That is my conclusion. Thank you very much. The next question is that the economic sanction may cause an unexpected impact. Well, for the time being, the economic sanction on Russia was huge in scale. Russian economy is the 12th in size on a global basis. It is not negligible, but it is not that huge compared to China. However, the imminent major impact is that the energy disruption, because Russia is a supplier of energy. So the economic sanction is imposed. However, the energy supply is continued. To some extent, some of the European countries continue to receive the Russian energy. So suspension of the energy supply would be the immediate impact, and that will have a knock-on effect. That is the plausible risk. During the winter season in Europe, and they run out of energy, and then the domestic order may be disrupted in Europe. And if they try to import energy from other countries, like Maghreb countries or Arab countries, then their reliance on the Middle East will increase. And then Europe's grip on these countries may be weakened. So in terms of the energy, there are visible factors. However, what was unexpected was that the a repercussion on the financial area, the SWIFT, that is the international settlement system to try to siege Russia. However, you have to be careful in handling of the SWIFT because you may go through the unexpected results or outcome. And of course, the financial authority are aware of that. And for example, Gazprom Bank are not excluded from SWIFT, so there are many loopholes. However, some creditors forces to Russia may face some repercussion or negative impacts if too much or excessive sanctions are imposed on Russia. And in the context of the human security, we talk about the refugee. The number of refugees from Ukraine is quite significant in scale currently. The many countries are sympathetic and are supporting and they are receiving those refugees. However, the outflux of refugees continues for many years. And then how will this be received? And also, this may be a little bit overlooked. However, some kind of exodus from Russia is also being witnessed. And what kind of ramification does it have on the neighboring countries? Should we welcome them? Or should we receive them with some alert or caution? So enabling small countries, especially the Georgia, the country that the Russians find it easy to go to, or the Kazakhstan. So many Russians have fled to these countries, and that may disrupt the domestic order of these countries. So this is also a plausible scenario. Last but not least, there are various risks. However, what is important here is to regard the risks as an opportunity. More than 80% of the energy in the world is fossil fuel driven. However, if we think that the too much reliance on Russian fossil fuel is too risky, then we can turn to the green energy, or we can shift to improving efficiency. So we can leverage the crisis toward the opportunity. And thinking about the resiliency, not only importing the cheap energy, but how should we be effective on a local basis? That is what we have to think about. Of course, that will require lots of efforts. However, how can run in an effective manner? That is a very important perspective from a viewpoint of economy. Where possible, I'd like to respond to your question. Well, at the time of Afghanistan, I had a similar experience. During the war, I started exchanges of information with Ministry of Foreign Affairs when I knew the way of thinking of the United States. So it was attack while controlling at the same time attacking the Kabul University. This will not be attacked after the war. This university can be utilized after the war. So it was a controlled attack. However, the peace came and we provided the support. It required lots of efforts and it was hard tasks. And in case of Ukraine, it was uncontrollable, and Russia, at its own will, attacking the Ukraine. So after the war, the situation of Ukraine would be quite hard. And the unexplosive bomb was something that that was mentioned earlier by Dr. Tadokoro. Unexplosive bomb and also landmine should be treated with care. Well, at the time of Cambodian crisis, the Japan provided various support, and in terms of capacity building, And those agencies we have provided various support are now gaining power to provide support to other countries. So such kind of support is necessary. And Dr. Tadokoro talked about the refugee. After the peace came, unless the recovery is achieved, that the people don't want to return. So when we run the survey of Ukrainians coming to Japan, just the peace alone is not enough. In the mid and long term, international collaboration should be provided for the recovery and reconstruction process. Thank you very much. There are other questions we want to ask, but from the audience, we have received several questions. And Adeta-san, there are two questions. Is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine could escalate to a wider global conflict? How significant is the UN's role in resolving this geopolitical conflict? Is the UN's relevancy matter in current global security issues? So what is the role of the United Nations? Is the UN's relevancy matter in current global security issues? This is a very serious question.
So maybe this is something to be taken up by Dr. Tadokoro. And another is when we look at countries like Africa, when we talked about the support for African countries, a lot of things are taking place in Africa. And maybe we should be looking at Africa with a distance. And this person, private military companies from Russia are sending private soldiers to these areas, I mean the vulnerable areas, and that is really adding oil to the fire. And also Chinese money is also finding its way into those vulnerable African areas. And regardless of the level of the degree of the conflict taking place, what do you think? How do you think China differs especially when you compare with Japan's support for those countries through efforts like JICA? So I am also interested in hearing your view on this. So for those two areas, so Dr. Tadokoro, can you take up this question? So whether the conflict will go global, of course there is that risk, and we are doing our best to prevent that from happening. That is why all the countries around the world are trying to find a solution. So, well, maybe I shouldn't be talking out too loud about this, but Russia is a nuclear power. That is a fact. And with that, I think there is a deterrence already at work to a certain degree, because the NATO countries are also trying to control their position vis-a-vis Ukraine because Russia is a nuclear power. And we had some statements about whether tactical nukes will be used, but if and only if nukes are used by Russia, then it doesn't mean that the NATO side should be immediately responding with the NATO nukes. But so the simple answer is yes, we always have that risk. And that is why all the countries in the world are trying to find a good answer. And we also already spoke about Taiwan, so I would not go in deeper. And now turning to the United Nations. So this depends on what you expect from the United Nations. So if you have very high expectations on the part of the United Nations, so this very clear and obvious UN member country was invaded by another UN member country. So that means the UN should be really playing a role. I mean, this is collective security, and I think this is with the expectation that the UN should be taking a leading role in this. But this kind of function actually has never worked so far in the UN framework. And Russia is the country that is in question right now. So that means we really cannot have a lot of high expectations. But that doesn't mean that we should entirely give up, because a lot of resolutions are being put to the table in the UN. And so deliberations are taking place involving a lot of countries. And when Russia is engaged in this kind of conflict, the UN provides a venue for some kind of communication to take place between Russia and the non-Russian countries. So it's better than having no UN at all. So when we say whether the UN is having any relevance or not, the answer would depend on what kind of expectations you have vis-a-vis the UN. So if it is a yes or a no question, then I would have to say yes, because having a UN is much better than having no UN at all. But it doesn't mean that the UN will be able to solve all problems. That is my point. Yes, I too believe that there are limits to the role that can be played by the UN, but even during the Cold War, even with small incidents, when was something that involved the West and the East, then the countries would use their veto power, and they ended in a deadlock. And so after 1990s, I think the mission to be expected of the UN has greatly increased. And so we need to at least maintain this level of expectation vis-a-vis the UN. So now, we also had in the question we had mentioned about the private military company by Russia, and I was listening to the BBC News this morning, and they actually had a news in Burkina Faso. They are actually utilizing these private soldiers in the border areas. And towards this, the president of Ghana is opposing this, because this puts the surrounding countries at stake. And I think this was the first time that a neighboring country ever made a point about this. And in Mali, it is a very well-known fact that Mali is taking a lot of private soldiers. But so Burkina Faso is following that. So even in Africa, I think many countries are taking this into consideration as an option. So from the point of China, I would also like to ask Dr. Takahara to talk about this, but I specialize in Africa. So in the old days, the support from China vis-a-vis Africa was a happy thing. So they would construct football stadiums, or they would construct the congressional building, so these people were happy. So, and now, as a second phase, beyond the entertainment side, now the Chinese assistance is going into construction of ports and other infrastructure. So that also makes the African countries happy, but at the same time, they are trapped in terms of the debt that is created as a result of those loans. So at what point do we observe Chinese assistance vis-a-vis Africa would really depend on what is actually taking place. So what do you think about this? Well, the support, I think the borderline between support and business from the Chinese side is somewhat unclear. But anyway, it is obvious that the Chinese are going into Africa. And I think this has its both pros and cons. African countries, due to a lot of impacts by COVID, etc., the GDP level went back to about a decade ago's level. That is true. But then it is also true that China's entry into Africa contributed to this kind of development. So why is it that the Chinese are going into Africa so proactively? I think there are 3 points, and this is something I heard from a Chinese person himself in Addis Ababa. One is the resources, the natural resources, and then the market. And then the third point is to provide political support, because in African continent has so many countries and they will be able to support China in terms of the numbers. So the first point about natural resources, the issue is that the Chinese are sucking up a lot of the resources. And the second point is about these emerging industries in Africa are facing a lot of cheap and low quality goods flooding in from China. So the way they provide support, the way the Chinese provide support is now becoming an issue. And so, and along with the money from China, a lot of Chinese people are going into Africa and creating a lot of issues between people as well. Thank you. Well, when I was actually an incumbent in the self-defense forces, Europe has a lot of experience dealing with African countries, and the Chinese support actually does not really contribute to generating employment, and because the Chinese bring their own people to do the work. And even for construction of infrastructures, it is not something that benefits the general public, but it focuses on benefiting just the upper class, like the presidential palace, etc. So the general public do not really perceive that they should be thankful for China for providing the support. And according to what Dr. Makino said, maybe they are gradually moving away from this kind of style. And also the indebtednent resulting in increased political influence by China. For example, when we look at southern Sudan and Afghanistan, by having the debt, the country goes bankrupt. And if that does happen, then we will be seeing another Afghanistan, another Somalia, and that is something we need to be prepared for. So in order to maintain a clear and open and free Indo-Pacific, we should be concerned about the stability of the region. So one point, we have a question.
I think this also contains the multiple aspects that each country are prioritizing themselves while other nation due to pandemic. Looking back Japan, it might be also the case. So many countries are focusing on unilateralism. They are protectionism, are just focusing on their own people, and they are not giving consideration to other countries. And this is not the favorable trend. And since the Ukrainian war, the discussion around the defense has increased and been activated. Looking at the reality of the world, given my background, I think this is something I should welcome. However, should we just concern about our own defense only? Looking around, we are surrounded by North Korea and China, and a neighboring country, Russia, is in a war. And that fighting ground is on the opposite side, and the other countries are also being affected. We cannot just focus on our own country. And given the impacts from the pandemic and from the viewpoint of a compounded crisis, the pandemic and Ukraine and other aspects is something we have to consider. And also, as Dr. Makino mentioned, and the food security issue of Africa and the pandemic and the Ukraine. So from this perspective, do you have a final word? We'd like to go around with each individual panelist. Well, this is exactly the risk. This is a surprise attack. But anyway, this is an out of blue question. Anyway, the country around the world do not have a leeway. All the time, the countries around the world prioritize their own country. That is a common sense. But countries tend to look at their own interests in a myopic manner, and if they do not have the leeway, they tend to just focus on their own country. And well, from that perspective, the stability of an international society in a broader sense will lead to the stability of your own country at the end of the day. That is something we should be conscious of all the time. When your neighboring countries in a disruption in a visible manner, for example, supply chain disruptions or influx of the refugee is something that you will be affected. Is something that will have an impact on you if there is a disruption in your neighboring country. And currently, not only on the financial market, but also through the cyber space, the various things have a ramification on other countries. So terrorism or international crime, in that way, this will have a repercussion on your own country. So doing good to other people is doing your good. Sometimes this proverb is misinterpreted by younger generation, but anyway, doing good to other people will leading to doing good to your own country. So we are running out of time, and we have one final question from the audience. Well, human security is the Western way of thinking. The support in the neutral position, for example, the support in the disaster reduction framework is more neutral, or it is harmless, politically speaking. So that is the area maybe we can leverage for the human security. So what is your take on this? The Sendai disaster reduction framework, and I think this person asking this question must be the one who is involved in the Sendai disaster reduction framework. Today we talk about the security. The Dr. Yamaguchi is an expert on this. The health security, and food security are also another facet. Sorry, I have to turn on camera. And the education security. So there are different facets of security. This sounds good, but they may have the disadvantages because we always think in silo in one particular category, but in a cross-functional manner or cross-sectoral manner, we have to think like Ukraine and the pandemic and the food security, etc. So in a cross-sectoral manner involving the multiple sectors, I would say that the Sendai disaster reduction framework is a great example that we can refer to when we are trying to promote the human security. So we can take lessons from this framework. Thank you very much. So time is up. With this, we would like to conclude the panel discussion.
はい。
Thank you very much to all of our participants and panelists. So now I would like to deliver the closing remarks, and this will be done by the moderator of today, Dr. Yamaguchi. So, Dr. Yamaguchi, please. Thank you very much. So, in conjunction with the International University of Japan and JICA we have been collaborating on many matters, both in research and development is one of them. And JICA and IUJ both are committed to pursue Japan getting engaged in international matters, both out in the field and both at the research level. So I think it is very fortunate that these two organizations can continue collaborating with each other. And today's symposium was one good example. So the people who have been engaged in human security matters, Mr. Makino, Director General Makino, delivered a presentation, and that was very informative. And I think it was very meaningful that and also a very creative approach for an organization like us to be able to engage in this kind of occasion. And we, as International University, are really delighted to be able to be part of this initiative. And so going forward, for any joint efforts to be pursued by IUJ and JICA, I think this will continue to contribute to what Japan can offer to the world. So if we can provide good ideas to each other to think of our next occasions, and I think this is a great first step that we were able to make today. And I hope that, I really thank the audience for also proactively participating in today's session, and all the panelists who provided us with very insightful presentations. So going forward, I really look forward to continue working with all of you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Yamaguchi. So if the panelists could kindly turn on their cameras, please. So today, the panelists provided us with very insightful presentations, and all of those who participated online, thank you for bearing us with us for a long time. So I would like to now close today's session, the Knowledge Forum.